Berman was in that committee, but she left before the vote, and then there was one other Democrat.
Yeah, I know there was only one that is.
Senator Monfort voted for it, he's the chair. Yes, in the back?
I had something to say about preemption. I was an activist for a very long time, and I will tell you the most successful anti-development regulation we have in the little city of Treasure Island was done by petition, by activism. It is now in our charter, the equivalent of our city constitution, and it was an anti-development related ordinance. So these things can be done. Once you get the ordinance, get it into your charter or your constitution. It's much stronger when you do that. Somebody talked about follow-up. When you win, you have to keep going. You have to strengthen it and make it so it can't be undone. So if you're going to make the effort to do the activism, make sure you follow it up. That's the first thing. Now, having been sitting on the city commission now for almost 2 years, we deal with state preemption on almost every meeting basis. You know, there's a big movement among the Florida League of Cities and all the small cities to make sure that all preemption laws are challenged from Republicans and Democrats across the whole spectrum of Florida. So what I try to do now as a sitting city commissioner, because we're a small city and we do not want to invite the fight because it costs us too much money in litigation, we can't do it. Maybe Alachua County can, but we can't. So what I try to do is find the cracks, and I'll give you an example. You can legislate in the cracks, because if you legislate in the cracks, eventually it'll widen and it'll open up. I'll give you an example. Everybody knows about the plastic straw ban. Everybody's trying to, so there's a set of proposals in the state legislation right now going through to preempt local governments from banning plastic straws, just putting it very simply, right? So this came up, one of our commissioners brought it up, and she wanted us to sign on to this. It's been, I think it's the city of Palm Beach is the main opponent. So she wanted to sign on to this, and a lovely little Republican on the commission said, oh no, we don't want to upset the apple cart. We have $2 million in grants sitting up at the state house, and if we do that, they won't give us our money for our roads. And the threatening really bothers me. But instead what we're going to do is we're going to legislate against plastic straws on public property and on public streets and on public sidewalks and in public parks. That arguably is not against whatever passes on the preemption side. So that's a crack. That's just an example of a crack. So if you have a chance, you come across your legislator and they're worried about voting against, you know, whatever it is, whatever, sit down and creatively try to figure out where the crack is, where they can legislate without fear of retribution at the legislative level with money or retribution in the form of litigation. So that's my suggestion.
And you're in Treasure Island?
Yes.
And that's in Pinellas County?
Yes. West of St. Petersburg.
This gentleman right here in the light blue shirt came up to me during lunch. He's a law student here. He lives in Pinellas County. And he said, what can I do? I said, find a city council person in Pinellas County who will put this forward to their council. And I thank you for volunteering to be that person.
All right, I have a couple of quick things.
Yeah.
Yes.
She's got
Yes.
her hand up.
I know, I got her. I've got her. I've got her. I've got you. You're next. Okay, hold on.
Also,
Hold on. I have two public announcements. One is, if you want to talk more about putting the Rights of Nature platform in the Democratic Party platform, Mel Martin here in the front row is the person who's responsible for making that happen. If you want to know more about that, talk to Mel. Also, John Moran has asked me to give a shout out to Gary Ormino. Gary, going once. Okay, they're looking for you in the back, apparently. So, all right, and now back to our regularly scheduled program. Thank you for waiting.
Also on the topic of preemption, it can cut both ways. Here in Alachua County, Gainesville enacted an ordinance, an air quality ordinance, which was negated by the offending cement plant moving to Newberry. And also in the fact of wetland regulations. Federal and state regulations are much stronger than communities, and they cannot be exempted from.
Yeah, there's some preemption, absolutely, that's good. The question is when a locality wants to adopt more stringent standards than the state or federal government, whether they should be allowed to do so. And preemption right now operates against that. So what you have is preemption is basically a vehicle used by the major economic actors in a state to privatize the clearing away of pesky communities who may want to take actions that interfere with their plans. That's essentially what happens. So we've been talking just about, we've been talking about some other issues, but, water extraction ordinances have been preempted in many different states. Regulation of genetically modified seeds. So planting of GMOs has been preempted, including in places like Hawaii, where they attempted to ban and regulate GM seeds and were overturned by preemption laws. Preemption actually is the most common tool because it's almost like the companies, the corporations, business entities saying, look, Ma, no hands. It's not us doing it, but it's the democratically elected legislature is doing it. So they can step back. It's once removed for them. And in addition, they don't have to chase you around with lawsuits. They pass one preemptive law, it clears the field. And so it's a good investment. It's a very efficient investment for them to clear the field with one legislative act, rather than having to chase you around in 200 different lawsuits trying to overturn X, Y, and Z. So strategically, if we had different value systems and we were in their shoes, we would be doing exactly the same thing. It makes perfect, rational, logical sense that they would be doing what they're doing. And so for us sometimes to express shock, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing it, is kind of naive. Because there's a playing field, they're using it. We haven't been on the field in decades. We wouldn't even know what to do if we got the ball. It's like the score is 9,546 to 0. So I've watched, it's like when we get the ball, everybody gets afraid and some people start running the other way. Like, oh my God, oh my God. And so we have to get past that, and we have to understand that what's happening in Florida is not only likely, it's predictable. And we have to stabilize ourselves because we tend to freak out. And that is the story of preemption, is that if we were on the other side, we'd be doing exactly the same thing. It's a game plan, it's predictable, it's a pattern. And that pattern in practice is only going to go away when we take that tool away. And the only way to take the tool away is to either carve out space in the courts by running a new legal theory, or carving out space through a constitutional amendment, some kind of state constitutional amendment that overrides the legislature. And so that's the spot that you're eventually probably going to be in here, rather than having this open playing field. And the only last thing I'll say is this, which is you can't take a power away that doesn't exist already. So one way of looking at this is they're trying to remove municipal authority, but in doing so, they're admitting that the municipal authority exists in the first place. That's something we sometimes don't think very hard about. So why remove it if it doesn't exist anyway? And they're admitting that municipalities have the rights, current legal authority, to adopt rights of nature laws. That's the flip side of this. And that won't necessarily come to light, won't be as well talked about as it probably should be. But that's one of the talking points. That's one of the ways to talk to people, is to say, this is a removal of authority that we currently have. Because sometimes we question ourselves, oh my God, do we actually have the authority to do this? Well, Senator Albritton says, you do. You have it, and we're taking it away. So there's all kinds of creative ways to talk about it, but we have to expect this stuff to happen. It's the game plan on the other side.
So in Florida, cities and non-charter counties require legislative authority for ordinances and laws that they adopt. Only non-charter counties have inherent authority to adopt whatever regulations they want. I mean, has there been a constitutional analysis under the Florida Constitution that demonstrates that all local governments can adopt right of nature ordinances? And then the question that follows after that is, unless you do a state constitutional amendment, how would that impact people's ability to challenge environmental permits and decisions of the state that impact nature?
Yeah, so Florida's no different than other states in one respect, which is you have chartered municipalities which have certain powers granted to them that are generally of wider latitude than what we call statutory municipalities, which are governed by general authorizing law from the state legislature. That general authorizing law, which most of the communities that we work with, the 500 or so over the past 20 years, are most under the statutory general municipal authority laws, which grant police power to the municipality generally to protect health, safety, and welfare. In other words, a general authorizing clause that's within those state authorizing provisions for statutory cities and statutory municipalities. We've leveraged that to say protecting health, safety, and welfare means not only having the power to veto certain projects like oil and gas extraction, but also expansion of rights. So the rights of nature, civil, political, environmental rights at the local level. That's how the whole legal theory is built. So having a charter municipality is like gravy. It's because charter municipalities have greater authority, more scope of authority than statutory municipalities do. But I have no doubt that health, safety, and welfare can also be used as that police power clause to allow passage of similar ordinances in statutory municipalities only. And the constitutional amendment that we've been talking about, and it's tough in these forums because we lead 2-day training sessions that are focused entirely on this particular question. So it's like telescoping some of this down. The state constitutional amendments are about expanding the authority of not only charter but also non-charter statutory municipalities as well to do certain things. Notably to expand civil, political, and environmental rights out at the local level. And the shorthand that we use is if a municipality wants to adopt a law that establishes more stringent standards, stringent environmental standards in the state, that they should be able to do so without interference from the state. That the state is unable to preempt that expansion of environmental standards at the local level. So that's the legal trellis that all of this works from. But if you're in a non-chartered municipality, those are the general clauses that you have to dig into. And almost all states have those for general statutory municipalities. But this isn't about restricting other activities that you may want to do in terms of challenging permits or engaging in some of the regulatory system stuff. It's about adding another layer to that of legislative authority for both statutory as well as chartered municipalities. So that's the lay of the land.
I see the future of rights for nature as not just legal rights, but political rights, reapportioning state legislatures and Congress to include guardians of nature in the political process so we can make laws that benefit nature instead of always being on the defensive. Is anyone on the panel with an organization who's going to work towards this?
I'd say, I don't know, the way, what I've heard today, it sounds like we're all working toward that, on the plan. I mean, in one form or another. Tom says we can get into the specifics of that, and you could spend a month just scratching the surface. But the actions that we've all taken, and I've only heard our stories just today, is about pursuing that. Establishment of who we are and what our rights, establishing who we are and what our rights are. And in my case, I do have a constitutional amendment in my constitution. It's sat there for 40 years that nobody knew what it meant until it was litigated in 2012. And that litigation, by the way, was primarily brought by Republican township supervisors that objected to the ripping out of zoning authority because the state of Pennsylvania granted on that map a use by right, for all of you planner types, a use by right in all zoning districts of the Commonwealth, going back to that picture of Versailles down along the Yacht River with the oil wells coming out of people's homes.
Is that the right of succession you were talking about?
No. This is about the right. If I live in a residential neighborhood, what goes in a residential neighborhood should be residential in character and use. But if I put an industrial use in that neighborhood, then I've defeated the whole idea of what zoning is about. And that is putting like things in like places. So you can have some reasonable expectation of what the land uses are going to be. If I build a $300,000 home and then all of a sudden this guy comes in next behind me, 500 feet away and puts a drill rig and a compressor station, I just lost the value of my property. And so That's what I'm talking about though, is if you go to the Pennsylvania Constitution, we have the right. Nobody knew what it was for 40 years, literally. It was only litigated twice and it only went to an appellate court, and the decisions were kind of wonky and bifurcated the amendment itself into 3 separate thoughts in a sentence rather than seeing it in total as the Supreme Court ruled in 2013. So having said that, I think we're all working to that. We had a constitutional amendment in Pennsylvania enacted in 72, but we're only using it now, 40 years later. It's like, wow, but those things are there. The treaties that are sitting there. Well, what do they say? And how do, going into the courts and beginning to say, hey, you guys signed this. And holding people's feet to the fire about what we are rather than accepting the fact that some big giant corporations just took over your state house and they write the legislation and these guys get a lunch and they put it in the hopper.
I'm talking about individuals who are legally bound to represent natural resources in the state, in Congress.
But I think that's true. I don't think you segment that out. I understand what you're saying, but that's what every elected official has to do right now. They have to not only look out for me, the taxpayer, the citizen, but all these other things that support my my pursuit of happiness, my health, welfare, and safety. So having a special, the way I hear it is there's some kind of special thing that comes to this, and I'm saying no, it's already part of that thing. And what we need to do is infuse some life into those elements of the total, because they're only using some of it. Our brains, we only use so much of it.
Could you clarify about the rights of succession? I'm not really sure I understand that.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. I don't.
Oh, earlier you were talking about the context of rights of nature, City of Pittsburgh community rights.
I say about succession from the Union, like South Carolina, or when they go on Fort Sumter. I'm talking about in our Bill of Rights, we state specifically that we don't recognize the authority of the United States or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania when it comes to making these decisions locally.
Oh,
and therefore we
secession.
secede, yes.
Not
Secede.
I'm all for it.
Okay, got it.
That's all it is.
Also respond to the question.
I'll get home for it.
I think what you're asking about is like who speaks for those without a voice, kind of. Because if we're starting to give these rights to nature, who is then speaking for what nature needs?
Well, I think we could find people who speak for nature, but there are already 100 senators and the entire Congress and all the state legislatures speak for their constituents, theoretically. We need people speaking exclusively for the resources and not persons, because the belief of everyone here is the planet is a unified whole and we are ignoring the resources. So
Right,
I think you do have to separate it out and say, we are representing the non-humans as opposed to everyone, because the needs of the persons are always going to trump the needs of the resources. That's just the way I see it.
So my point that I wanted to say is that what you're saying is kind of going back to indigenous ways of thinking, is that, every decision that you're making needs to be made through this lens of doing what's right for the whole community, which includes the non-human members of that community. And so I see what Doug is saying, that it shouldn't be separate. I see what you're saying, because of the system that is now, that decision isn't being made into that process. And so again, that's kind of like an evolution that we're gonna see, later down the line, is how to start, mainstreaming some of these ways of looking at things.
Okay, Ken.
Okay, so I'm not sure what the question is, but my thinking is that maybe we've already got a little conflict here over some land title matters. Because in the state of Florida, if I understand it right, the state of Florida trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund have jurisdiction over the waters that were considered navigable at the time that Florida became a state. So I'm wondering if we might challenge that in some way, as the people of the state of Florida, we're technically the owners of the state lands, that the trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund are supposed to be protecting for us already. Maybe we need a class action suit against the trustees for not doing their job.
That's what they did in Pennsylvania.
Oh, is that it?
Yeah.
Oh, geez. Great idea.
There was a case,
But I think it could be a land title thing, just throwing that out there.
The Environmental Defense Foundation out of Philly did exactly that because the Constitution of Pennsylvania said that these lands held in common, meaning, state-owned land,
Right.
land, your land, and they are trustees of that region,
Yeah.
of those lands. And so when they leased out all the state parks and state forest lands in Pennsylvania, the royalties from those leases were flowing to the general fund and then apportioned out in the budget. And the Environmental Defense Foundation, this is a case everybody should go look up. What was it? Thank you again.
Did it work?
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, the decision was earth-shattering. I was like, holy crap, well, look at that one. This all springs from the Robinson Township case of decision of 2013, and then this came out, 2017 or 2018? 2017? Something like that.
What is it called?
Environmental Defense Foundation out of Philadelphia sued the Commonwealth, and they said it was unconstitutional for them to take the money that the state was making on royalties and put it into the general fund.
Yeah.
That this wasn't something that belonged to the state, that they could do what they will. The Constitution makes it clear that they are trustees, and Justice Donahoe wrote the opinion, D-O-N-O-U-H-E, Donahoe. They're part of the Federated Investors Community, a family, if you've never heard of that. But anyway, Justice Donahoe put it in very clear terms. And they applied the law of trustees have a duty to the person they're holding it in trust for, and they just can't do willy-nilly what they want with it. It doesn't belong to them. And so what the state said was this: you can no longer, or what the Supreme Court said to the legislatures, you can no longer take the money you're making from the parks and put it in the general fund. It has to go back to the corpus of the trust. So now my parks are going to have gold-plated park benches, and my state troopers are going to ride around in old cars with the fenders falling off because they don't have any money. But that was a big deal because the state's like, oh, we're making all this money to pay for stuff off the royalties from the trust that belongs to you. And you said, well, I didn't authorize you to do that. And so the Supreme Court said, yeah, you're right. And that money has to stay with the trust, which is the state game lands and the state parks. Oh, boy.
Okay, well, I didn't mean to add that twist to it so late in the day, but
That's a good one.
just a thought that that won't pick up all the waterways. That will only pick up the state, the ones that are under state jurisdiction.
You
So,
can't apply the law of trust
okay.
to that.
And then-
those trustees are bound by that, and I'm sure Florida has a much different trustee law.
It's basically the governor's cabinet, though, so we know where we're at on that. And another thing I was thinking of, prescriptive rights. We might be able to go somewhere with that, too, for use. But that's just, sorry,
Good.
out there.
Yeah, that's good. Brainstorming is good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I know you're going.
Jean, did you have a question?
I know you're going.
Kind of neophyte. Okay,